Imagine hitting the absolute pinnacle of power in the United States government. Now, imagine doing that twice, but in two totally different branches. And then, imagine history basically just remembering you for the job you literally hated and for some wildly exaggerated myth about your bathroom habits. Crazy, right? Well, let's just dive right into this, because today's explainer is all about the profoundly dramatic, honestly kind of ironic, dual life of William Howard Taft.
So we've got to address the elephant in the room right off the bat. Was President Taft actually stuck in a White House bathtub? I mean, it's like the one piece of trivia everybody thinks they know about the guy. But here are the actual facts. Yes, Taft was a very large man. He was a heavyweight wrestling champion back at Yale, and he did weigh over 300 pounds during his presidency. And yeah, he actually had a special extra-large bathtub installed in the White House. But the whole getting stuck story? Totally a myth. It's a complete fabrication that just popped up decades later. And honestly, it's a massive shame, because that silly caricature completely overshadows one of the most uniquely consequential legacies in all of American history.
Because get this, here is a mind-blowing historical double-double for you. William Howard Taft is literally the only person in American history to serve as both the 27th President of the United States, so head of the executive branch, and later on as the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the head of the judicial branch. Nobody else has ever done that. But to really understand how this happened, we have to look at which of these two massive jobs was actually his dream.
Section 1. The Myth versus the Man, a life chasing the bench.
See, Taft's true passion was never, ever politics. It was always the law. He grew up in this heavily legal family. His dad was a U.S. Attorney General and a judge, and Taft himself was appointed as a federal circuit judge by the time he was just 34. He actually deeply resented politics. In fact, he famously resigned from an early political patronage job, reportedly saying, "Politics make me sick." The bench was his home. In 1889, at only 32 years old, he became the youngest Solicitor General in U.S. history. That meant he was the guy representing the United States in front of the Supreme Court. And out of 18 cases he argued before the High Court, he won 16 of them. 16! He was a brilliant, meticulous jurist, absolutely on the fast track to the Supreme Court. But fate, and honestly some very ambitious people in his orbit.
Section 2, a reluctant but ruthless executive. So, how exactly does a guy who literally hates politics end up as President of the United States? Well, he gets pushed into it, specifically by his highly ambitious wife Nellie and his best friend at the time, President Theodore Roosevelt. Giving in to all that pressure, Taft ran in the 1908 election and, well, he won.
Yet the second he was in the Oval Office, that sharp legal mind of his went straight to work. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had this massive reputation as the great trust buster, right? The guy who broke up corporate monopolies. But the numbers tell a totally different story. The reluctant President Taft actually filed twice as many antitrust suits as his predecessor, Roosevelt. Twice as many. Taft approached the presidency almost exactly like a judge. He weighed the law strictly and prosecuted those monopolies totally by the book, without any of the flashy political showmanship that Roosevelt was so famous for.
Section 3. Substituting dollars for bullets, the dollar diplomacy experiment.
Taft brought that same unique, super lawyerly philosophy over to his foreign policy. He really wanted to pivot away from using military force and instead leverage America's massive, rapidly growing economic wealth. He laid this out super clearly in his 1912 State of the Union address, and he coined a phrase that would completely define the era: substituting dollars for bullets. And this became known as dollar diplomacy. The core idea here was to use American financial investment to ensure stability abroad, resolve diplomatic issues, and at the exact same time promote American commercial interests. Honestly, on paper, it sounded like a total win-win, a very pragmatic, lawyerly solution to global conflict.
So the really crucial point here is how they actually tested this theory out in the real world. The Taft administration, spearheaded by his Secretary of State, aggressively focused on two main regions. First, in Central America, they actually tried to buy up the debt those nations owed to European countries, hoping to stabilize the region. And then over in Asia, they sought to finance major infrastructure projects, like the Guangzhou-Hankou Railway in China, mostly to maintain the balance of power over there. And get this, it wasn't just government money funding this. Taft relied heavily on American industrial titans, guys like J.P. Morgan, to personally bankroll these huge diplomatic ventures. But the whole experiment ultimately collapsed. Instead of creating all this peace, that financial intervention sparked some fierce nationalist resentment down in Central America. The locals saw it as outside interference, which led to uprisings which, ironically, forced the U.S. to intervene militarily anyway in what eventually became known as the Banana Wars. Meanwhile, over in Asia, the policy completely alienated Japan and Russia. They looked at the U.S. moves as pure imperialist overreach. So, rather than stabilizing the region, dollar diplomacy basically sowed these deep, deep seeds of mistrust that would eventually culminate in the massive tensions of World War II.
Section 4. The center seat at last. You see, after suffering a really crushing presidential defeat in 1912, Taft was actually thrilled. He happily retreated to Yale to teach law, and he stayed there perfectly content until 1921, when President Harding finally called him up and offered him the job he'd been dreaming about his entire life: Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Section 5. Rewiring the federal judiciary.
Because, man, when Taft finally arrived at the Supreme Court, he walked right into an absolute crisis. The federal judiciary at the time was just a clunky, heavily localized 19th century mess. It was completely unequipped to handle the massive flood of modern litigation, especially all the new criminal cases being triggered by Prohibition. Prior to Taft taking over, judges really just saw themselves as equals in the super disconnected network of regional courts. But Taft, he brought what was called an executive principle to the judicial branch. He wanted to take all these fractured little pieces and unify them into one cohesive, efficient, and rigorous national institution. He didn't just want to be a judge anymore. He wanted to be the CEO of the courts. So after just one single year as Chief Justice, Taft aggressively lobbied Congress to pass the Conference of Senior Circuit Judges Act of 1922, and this thing was absolutely revolutionary. Not only did it add 24 desperately needed district judges, but for the very first time, it granted the Chief Justice the actual power to transfer judges from overstaffed districts over to understaffed ones. It also established the Judicial Conference, which was a centralized administrative body. Practically overnight, Taft had successfully redefined the entire role of Chief Justice. He took it from being just the first among equals to being the true executive manager of the entire federal judiciary. But his own court, the Supreme Court itself, was still totally drowning. The core problem was something called obligatory jurisdiction. Essentially, the laws back then required the Supreme Court to hear almost every single appeal that was brought before it, no matter how trivial it was. So when Taft arrived, there was this staggering backlog. It was literally taking up to 15 months just to hear a case after it was initially filed. And for Taft, a guy who deeply, truly believed that justice delayed is justice denied, this level of inefficiency was just intolerable. So he engineered an absolutely monumental fix. He drafted what became known as the Judges' Bill of 1925. And in a move that was completely unheard of for a sitting Chief Justice, Taft personally and relentlessly lobbied Congress. He curried favor with the media, he enlisted the American Bar Association, whatever it took to get it passed. And it worked. The bill converted the court's mandatory caseload into discretionary jurisdiction. We call this the modern certiorari process. This basically meant the Supreme Court can now just choose not to hear a case, which allowed them to focus strictly on resolving constitutional questions of true national importance. He fundamentally shifted the entire power and purpose of the Supreme Court.
Taft's tenure as Chief Justice was just this incredible era of reform, and by all accounts, it was the absolute happiest time of his life. He brought harmony back to the court, he streamlined American justice, and ultimately he laid the essential groundwork for the modern, co-equal judicial branch that we know today. Reflecting on his crazy journey from the White House to the bench, Taft famously wrote a line that I think just perfectly captures his soul. He said, "I don't remember that I ever was president."
It really leaves us with a fascinating perspective, doesn't it? We started this explainer with a silly myth about a man stuck in a bathtub, a president widely viewed as just a mediocre placeholder between Roosevelt and Wilson. But when we zoom out and look at the whole picture, we see an unparalleled architectural legacy in the U.S. government. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about. How should history really measure success? Do we judge a person by the highest office that was forced upon them, or by the lasting structural legacy they built by choice? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.